Episodes on BBC iPlayer.
With discussions of the latest news, we join Graham Stewart now for the 9.
Tonight, is Humza Yousaf's government teetering on the edge? He ditches the Greens, but they will vote with the Conservatives to try and unseat him. So are we heading towards an early election? We'll hear from both parties and get all the political analysis. Harvey Weinstein, the disgraced Hollywood producer, has his 2020 rape conviction overturned by New York's highest court. And more teenage boys smoke cannabis in Scotland than anywhere else in the world, the report claims.
Coming up in the sport, we'll have the latest from tonight's Premier League action, and with 50 days to go until the Euros, we hear from Scotland boss Steve Clarke on this year's tournament in Germany, his biggest achievement and his dad.
And later, the gay veteran who helped secure a memorial for LGBT officers.
Welcome to the 9.
So, just before 8:30 this morning, the deal which kept the Greens in government with the SNP collapsed. The First Minister, Humza Yousaf, said the agreement was no longer in the best interests of Scotland. From the Greens, there's been barely contained fury, and this afternoon they announced they would side with the Conservatives in a vote of no confidence in the First Minister. Earlier, the Tory leader Douglas Ross had announced the plan to table the vote. It's thought that will take place next week. So what happens if Humza Yousaf loses? Well, he'll be under enormous pressure to resign, and MSPs have to choose a new First Minister by a majority vote. But here's the problem. The SNP doesn't have a majority of MSPs in Holyrood. The Scottish Government was only able to command one through its agreement with the Greens. And it now means the SNP will have to run a minority government. Now, as you can see here, in the last election in 2021, it won 63 seats. And that's just 2 short of majority, so it paired up with the pro-independence Greens, who won 7 seats. Now, if Parliament can't agree on a new First Minister, well, what then? Well, frankly, we're in uncharted territory. But it could mean an election. Well, we'll be hearing from both the SNP and the Greens and getting all the political analysis tonight. But first, here's our political correspondent, Lindsay Bewes, with the day's events.
Is the agreement with the SNP over?
An early exit from Bute House and an early exit from government for the Greens co-leaders. Their power-sharing deal brought to an abrupt end after a meeting with the First Minister this morning.
2, 1.
As recently as Tuesday, Humza Yousaf insisted he didn't want to cut ties.
I value the partnership and cooperation agreement with the Greens, and I can see the benefit, and I think the people of Scotland can feel the benefit.
Less than 48 hours later, a major U-turn, the First Minister announcing his decision to dump his junior partners.
The Bute House agreement was intended to provide stability to the Scottish Government, and it has made possible a number of achievements, but it has served its purpose. I believe that going forward, it is in the best interests of the people of Scotland to pursue a different arrangement.
The Greens had been due to offer their members a vote on whether to continue supporting the SNP in power. Relations had strained over watered-down climate targets and the response to a review of gender identity services for children.
The First Minister has decided, I'm sorry to say, to capitulate to the most reactionary, backward-looking forces within the SNP, and it's the opposite of what's in Scotland's best interests.
I think the future generations of Scotland have been betrayed. The progressive policies that Greens were working towards were about creating a long-standing vision for a greener and fairer Scotland, and now anything we see brought to the Chamber will be watered down, delayed, underfunded.
There had been some concerns in the SNP over Green influence in government. including too great a focus on trans rights.
I think the First Minister might be a bit tetchy today. I wonder why.
But Humza Yousaf's most pressing challenge is survival. The Tory leader announcing his plans to lodge a vote of no confidence in the First Minister.
He has abandoned the platform he stood on. He claims it's now a new beginning. But really, it's the beginning of the end. Isn't Humza Yousaf a lame duck First Minister?
Labour wants an election.
The people of Scotland can see that the SNP have lost their way. They're weak, divided, incompetent and putting party before country.
After a bruising day, the Greens return to strike a final blow, no longer believing their goals will be delivered by the First Minister.
The sudden ending of the Butte House Agreement today calls the delivery of those objectives into question. And therefore, the Scottish Green MSPs have decided that we will support a vote of no confidence in the First Minister.
The Greens' anger over this breakup has been plain to see, and now they've made Humza Yousaf's survival as First Minister very difficult. He began the day by effectively sacking 2 ministers. Now his own future in government is in doubt. Lindsay Buse, BBC News, Holyrood.
Let's go back to the start of the day. Why did the agreement break down in the first place? Well, I've been speaking to our political correspondent, Jenny Davidson.
Well, there are 2 key issues, Graham, that have really put a rift between the SNP and the Greens over the past week. One is climate targets and the other is transgender healthcare. Now, on climate targets, last week the Scottish Government announced it was dropping a key target of reducing emissions by 75% by 2030 because they could no longer reach that target. Now, the Greens accepted that up to a point, but we were hearing comments from Patrick Harvie along the lines of people grandstanding about targets while not taking the action that's needed, which certainly sounded like a pop at some of his SNP colleagues. And as I say, the other issue is transgender healthcare, and in particular the Cass report on gender services in England. Now the First Minister has indicated that he wants to give that serious consideration, whereas the Greens have said that it's biased. They've called into question whether it's scientific. And then last Thursday, the NHS announced that it will pause prescribing puberty blockers to teenagers in Scotland. That's angered some in the Green Party. One group, the Rainbow Greens, then called for a vote among Green members on whether to remain in the Scottish Government.
And Jenny, the focus now on a vote of no confidence in the First Minister next week. And lots of talk about Ash Regan of the Alba Party and how she could hold the balance of power. Just remind us a little bit about Ash Regan and why her vote is so important.
Well, Ash Regan is actually a former SNP MSP, a former Scottish Government minister. And just a year ago, she ran against Humza Yousaf in the SNP leadership election. Just after that, she then changed parties, joined ALPA, and she's now the sole ALPA MSP. And she could play a very defining role in whether Humza Yousaf survives this vote of no confidence, which we expect may come next week. Now, that's because he now, without the Butte House Agreement with the Greens, has a minority government. The SNP has 63 MSPs, but the opposition parties together have 65. Now, the Greens have already indicated earlier this evening that they're going to vote for that no confidence vote. So really the only hope now is that Humza Yousaf can do a deal with Ash Regan. That would mean a 64-64 tie. In that case, the presiding officer would cast the final vote, which she would do for the current situation, for the status quo, meaning Humza Yousaf would stay in place. But it would hardly be a resounding vote of confidence, very, very narrow victory there. And Ash Regan is yet to decide whether she's going to support Humza Yousaf. She has a list of things she wants to do a deal on. They're going to be talking about that in the coming days, but who would have thought she would become the kingmaker?
Yeah, Jenny Davidson outside the Scottish Parliament, thank you. So a turbulent day in Holyrood and the dust hasn't settled just yet. There were several SNP politicians who, in recent years, have become increasingly outspoken about their opposition to a deal with the Greens. One of them is Fergus Ewing. So has he got what he wanted now?
Had the Butte House agreement remained in place until 226, then, in my view, the SNP would have faced likely annihilation, because most people would conclude at that 226 election that by voting the SNP, you would again get the Greens in government. In other words, we would be creating the most gigantic motivator to have people vote against the SNP. This now gives us the chance of a fresh start. And of course, there's a motion of no confidence, but either Humza survives or there is 28 days in which to find a new leader in which Parliament has confidence. And either way, the SNP can come through this. But the Green Deal itself was just a complete disaster for the party. We've not just lost tens of thousands of members, but our support has plummeted, and we face losing many MPs who worked hard over the years.
The reality is, though, the SNP doesn't have a majority in Parliament. To get its policies through, it has to come to some kind of deal, even on a vote-by-vote basis, with another party. Now, the Greens don't sound like they're up for it. Who on earth else is going to support the SNP?
The Greens are a bit touchy at the moment in reacting to the decision that Humza rightly took today. But, you know, we've been here before, Graham, and I was there from 2007 to 11. We didn't have 63 MSPs then, we had only 47. And we did deals with the parties on a day-to-day basis. We lost votes, but the only one that really counts is the budget. And we were able to do deals to get our budget.
Right, but the more immediate priority would be who's going to be the First Minister. And if there's going to be a motion of no confidence, and the Greens have made it quite clear that they're not going to vote to see Humza Yousaf continue in post, then what on earth's going to happen? It's going to mean a general election, isn't it? A Holyrood election. No, there's 28 days in which to find another leader in whom the Parliament does have confidence. And I'm giving Humza my vote, giving him a chance. But who else would?
Well, I expect that he's got a reasonable chance of surviving. But what I'm saying is, if he doesn't, then we can pick another leader who can earn the trust of confidence. You know, the public don't really like snap elections, and I'm not sure that every party in Holyrood really wants an election.
And would you see Kate Forbes as the natural successor?
She very nearly won last time. She's widely regarded as an excellent MSP and person. And if she runs again, I will most certainly support her. And I think also, actually, Graham, the tone that she conveys of working with people gels with what I feel people in Scotland may wish.
But the Greens won't work with her. Would she have to come to a deal with, say, the Tories?
Well, she would work with all the other parties. And this is the thing, Graham. I mean, I've recently fought a campaign in my constituency to save a health centre which was nearing completion, but the money was withdrawn. We fought a cross-party campaign and we won. We won in 4 weeks, and the campaign was well executed.
So there are no red lines for you, because given the way the SNP has spoken over previous years, I mean, doing a deal with the Tories would sound like doing a deal with the devil, but you don't think that should be the case?
No, I think that what the people want, I'm just going to finish the point, was that in my constituency, every single letter of thanks I got said that it is so good to see politicians working together. Yes, we have differences, primarily on independence, but we can agree. There's not actually that much between us on many issues on a day-to-day basis. It's worked before in 2007, when we had only 47, not 63. It can work again.
OK, Fergus Ewing, thank you very much indeed. OK, let's speak to Kathleen Nutt, political correspondent with The Herald, and Paul Hutchin, political editor with The Daily Record. Kathleen, was this a huge miscalculation on Humza Yousaf's part?
That is, at the moment, quite difficult to say. I think the position is, from what we've been told by SNP sources, is that this scenario was factored in, that could be a no confidence vote, and that the Greens may support that. That's what I've been told, but we don't know whether the First Minister was taken by surprise when the Greens announced that they would be backing the Conservative motion of no confidence. So it remains to be seen what happens next week. Alex Salmond, previous First Minister, and previous first SNP leader, has said that if Humza was a horse, he wouldn't be backing him.
Right.
And given that Ash Regan is an Alba MSP, and her vote will be absolutely critical to whether the First Minister survives the vote of no confidence, I think that's a really uncertain time, I think, for the First Minister.
Paul, is the First Minister toast, or is it way too early to say?
I think he's in a very difficult position. I can see why he decided to dump the Greens, but if you war game it, I think the Greens were always going to be very bitter and angry about their rejection. I think it was always likely they would back a motion of no confidence, and the numbers on that look very tight. And even if he survives, what sort of confidence will the Parliament have in the First Minister? I think that every vote will be a war of attrition. Every piece of legislation will be effectively a referendum on him. I just can't ever see him getting the momentum and traction that he needs to be a sustainable First Minister. And I think, in
terms of the choice today, do you think he was stuck between a rock and a hard place? Because, I mean, what was the alternative, really? Wait till the Greens dumped him?
I think that he didn't have any good options. He could have stuck with the Greens, but they had this crazy situation of having a members' vote in about 4 to 5 weeks, during which all the focus would be on them. They would make all sorts of reasonable demands, and Humza Yousaf and his minister would have to keep their mouth shut. The alternative was doing what he did today. I don't think there was a good option for him, and that is reflective of the fact that he doesn't have a majority. He's only got a minority of MSPs, and we're in a situation where the opposition parties do not want to help him in any way whatsoever. This is not like 2007, where he could perhaps, Alex Salmond could rely on the support of the Tories. Politics has changed fundamentally since the independence referendum. It's split down the middle on the Constitution, and that's just a fact of life.
Yeah, much more polarised. Kathleen, it's interesting what Fergus Ewing was saying there. He certainly seems happy, but do you think people who are on the more traditional right wing of the party, do you think that they are playing with fire here? Because this could end up in an election. We don't know what would happen then.
Well, I suppose there have been speculation in the past few days that some people in the more centrist part of the SNP want a leadership election. I had a story on Sunday quoting senior SNP figures who said it's just a matter of when, not if, he goes. So they are expecting pressure like this to weaken him, which is what they effectively want. They want a leadership contest. They want somebody like Kate Forbes to stand, maybe have some sort of pact with Stephen Flynn, the Westminster SNP Westminster leader. They still want a contest, but they think that their hand would be strengthened if there's an alliance between those two figures, and from somebody more aligned with Humza Yousaf to stand against Kate Forbes in a leadership contest. So I think that's a really interesting scenario that will happen. But at the moment, I mean, they will be backing Humza Yousaf in the leadership in no confidence vote next week. But we'll have to see how things develop after that.
Well, hold that thought. We'll return to that in just a second. But first, let's hear from the Greens. Here's the MSP, Ross Greer. And I asked him what his party hopes to achieve by supporting a no-confidence vote in Humza Yousaf.
The Scottish Greens exist to fight for a fairer and a greener Scotland. We exist to fight for people and planet In 2.5 years of government, that's what we were delivering on. We were delivering record climate action. We lifted 90,000 children out of poverty last year. The First Minister has chosen to end that agreement. He has chosen to end our progressive, pro-independence majority government and the policy programme that it was based on. The SNP are lurching to the right. He has caved in to the most conservative and bigoted forces in Scottish politics. And fundamentally, he's ended a confidence agreement between our parties. So we are under absolutely no obligation, and we certainly no longer have any confidence in him and his ability to lead this country.
But you talk about these right-wing forces in his party. If you end up bringing him down, doesn't that make it more likely somebody like Kate Forbes, who's on the right of the party, would be more likely to be First Minister? And that would be down to you, wouldn't it?
The statement that Humza Yousaf gave this morning from Butte House read like the statement of a hostage. It had been written for him by these conservative forces who are now ultimately in control of the Scottish Government. We know that if this government, as it stands, this SNP minority government led by Humza Yousaf, stays in place, it will lurch to the right. It is about taking Scotland backwards now. Those are the forces who now have control over Humza Yousaf.
And if it doesn't stay in place, it's likely to go to the right anyway, isn't it?
If the Scottish Parliament cannot appoint a First Minister, it goes to an election. And election outcomes are uncertain. What is certain right now is without some kind of change, this SNP government is not a force for progress in Scotland.
You actually
it will not make this
welcome
a
an
fairer,
election
greener
sooner
country.
rather than later. Would you like to see a Holyrood election?
The Scottish Greens are polling above what we were at the last election. Over the last 2.5 years, more voters have decided to go green because they've seen our record of delivery. We're the reason there's no peak time fares on the railways. We delivered a rent freeze, an eviction ban, free bus travel for young people. So absolutely, if there's an election coming up, we would be very confident about that. But fundamentally, this isn't about political parties. It's about what's good for the public and what's good for the planet. This government remaining in place as a SNP minority, dependent on these conservative, bigoted, reactionary forces, is not good for Scotland.
But then you've
so
got
the
to
Greens
think
can't
about the
support that.
consequences and who you might back instead. Could you see yourself doing a deal with Scottish Labour, for example?
That's absolutely not on the cards at the
Why
moment,
not?
no. For a start, on a pure arithmetical level, there's no majority government to be found between the Greens and the Labour Party. And there's a difference of opinion between the Greens and the Labour Party. Sadly, the Greens are the last party in Scotland at the moment really fighting for that fairer, greener, that more progressive country.
So you
the
wouldn't
Labour
actually
Party
deal with
opposes
anybody,
rent
would you, in the
controls,
end?
for example.
There's nobody you would deal with.
It's Humza Yousaf's decision to end a government that was actually based on cooperation between political parties.
I'm just not sure how you get any further with any of your, political ideals if you can't do a deal with anybody. You're in the wilderness, aren't you?
We were working together with the
But you're not now.
SNP to deliver on it. Exactly, and it was Humza Yousaf who chose to end that. He now needs to deal with the consequences.
What does it mean
of
for
that.
the independence movement? Because you're kind of breaking that up as well, aren't you?
Humza Yousaf has chosen to end the pro-independence majority government that we have. The Scottish Greens are still absolutely committed to Scotland's future being in Scotland's hands. We will continue to campaign for independence. Humza
But you
Yousaf
can't
has chosen
achieve
to
that
end
as
the
a minority
pro-independence
in
majority
Parliament.
government
That's the
that we
point,
have.
isn't it? You don't have any power now.
We have a mandate from our members and our voters to deliver on our manifesto. We were doing that from within government. We will now work responsibly in Parliament on an issue-by-issue basis to get as much of our agenda through as we can. That's what responsible parties do in Parliament.
I mean, isn't
But
all of
we are
this just
currently being
spite on
asked if
your
we have
part, that you're
confidence
hurting
in
as a
Humza Yousaf, and
party,
we don't.
you've been humiliated by the SNP, and essentially you're just throwing your toys out the pram, aren't you?
Not at all. The Scottish Greens exist to build a fairer, greener Scotland, and we're being asked if we have confidence in Humza Yousaf's abilities in Parliament next week. We are not confident that Humza Yousaf, beholden to conservative and bigoted forces, will actually deliver a fairer, greener Scotland, because he has explicitly chosen to end the agreement that was delivering that.
Okay.
We simply need to be honest. That's what all politicians should do next week.
Ross Greer, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, Kathleen, isn't it quite remarkable that the Greens would vote with the Tories to bring down a government? It's like 1979 all over again for those with long memories.
It is an absolutely remarkable development. I can't think of any time where the Greens have agreed with the Conservatives, and I think it probably just demonstrates and reflects the level of anger among Greens. They also, I spoke to a number of senior Greens in Parliament tonight, and they believe that the EGM that they were due to hold next month, where the Bute House Agreement would be put to a vote of members, the party would have actually backed the Bute House Agreement surviving. So they believe that the First Minister has panicked unnecessarily.
It's interesting that, Paul, isn't it? Do you think that's the case?
I can see why it would be interpreted as a panic measure, but equally I can understand why the First Minister would be frustrated. He was essentially having to live under the internal processes of the Scottish Green Party. They would determine when the EGM would take place, they would determine the process, and during that process he would just have to live with it and keep his mouth shut. So in that sense, I think it's understandable that he decided to pull the plug, but that has ramifications, it has consequences, and such as the Scottish Greens withdrawing all cooperation from the Scottish Government and essentially siding with the Conservatives, Labour, Lib Dems and the pro-UK parties.
Do you think the Greens have a strategy here, or are they just so angry they've thought, look, we just had enough, frankly?
I spoke to someone in the Greens today and he likened it to an angry and bitter divorce, and I think if someone goes through an angry and bitter divorce, they should be expected to act in a certain way. I think the Greens are hurting, they feel bitter, they feel hurt. Who knows how they'll feel in the cold light of day in the early days of next week. I expect them to maintain their position that they will vote for the motion of no confidence, but perhaps they'll soften their position.
And we're in weird political territory now, Kathleen, because Ash Regan, who is the Alba Party's only MSP in the Parliament, she could be holding the balance of power.
Yes, the parliamentary arithmetic means that she has this sort of deciding vote, and well, we heard from Alex Salmond earlier. He was saying that he wouldn't, if he was gambling, he wouldn't back Humza as a winner on this. So she has made a list of demands to the First Minister, or is in the process of doing that. And I think she'd probably be, probably making those quite high demands.
Do you think Humza Yousaf would be interested in doing some sort of deal with her?
I'm not sure. I mean, there's also rumours going around Parliament that some MSPs from other parties might be mysteriously sick next week, and that perhaps might be money going to certain constituencies. That's the sort of thing. This is the rumour mill, but these are the sort of things that people are discussing.
Paul, do you see Humza Yousaf doing various deals with maybe, I don't know, trying to appeal to the Greens if there's anything left in that relationship, or appealing to Ash Regan or others?
I mean, I think that Humza Yousaf would rather jump off a cliff than deal with Alex Salmond, frankly. I would expect there to be some sort of overture to the Scottish Greens. Of course, for there to be a 64-64 vote, you would need all of his critics to be in the chamber or voting remotely. Who knows, there might be a couple of absences, as was previously alluded to. So I think it looks bad for him, but I don't think that it's terminal. Who knows what's going to happen over the next
And what's Anas
so.
Sarwar thinking now? Do you think he's just hoping for an election, and would he have a good chance if an election was to be called?
I think all the opinion polls show that Labour would do very well if there was a Holyrood election tomorrow, but there isn't going to be one. I think that his preferred position would be for the SNP to be led by a weak leader. He would argue that Humza Yousaf fits that category. He probably wants him to stay in place, just sort of limping on until the Holyrood election 2026, when he would hope that he would defeat him. But a lot can happen between now and then.
Okay.
I think there's a lot in this race still to go on.
Let me just quickly ask Kathleen, look into your political ball, will there be an election this year, a Holyrood election that is?
I personally don't think there'll be a Holyrood election this year.
Right, we'll hold you to that. Kathleen Nutt and Paul Hutchin, thank you very much indeed. And later on in the programme, I'll be joined by the polling expert, Professor Sir John Curtis, who will be giving us his analysis of how the parties might fare in an election. Right, some other news from today now, and the US Supreme Court